Why did the room go so quiet when all she did was stop sweeping? The squeak of one stubborn wheel echoed in the vast auditorium, a lonely sound swallowed by marble walls and polished oak. 600 cadets sat in razor-straight rows, their eyes locked on the towering figure of Colonel Harrison. He commanded the stage with practiced authority, laser pointer in hand, voice booming, as he lectured about tactics and unconventional warfare. His words filled the air like scripture. And somewhere in the shadows pushed her cleaning cart. At 52, she had perfected the art of being invisible. The uniform she wore was not the pressed, proud cloth of service. It was blue polyester, faded by years of bleach and endless wash cycles, stitched and restitched where seams had given out. Her graying hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. The mop bucket clinked softly against the handle with every careful step, a rhythm she had learned to time so it never disrupted a speaker's cadence. She had been here for 8 years, long enough to know that invisibility was safer than recognition, long enough to feel the ache of silence settle in her bones. But today was different. Today, when the colonel set his marker on the tactical board confidently, like a chess master claiming checkmate, felt her chest tighten. She knew instantly it was wrong, not theory wrong, not could work better wrong, catastrophically wrong. She recognized the terrain he pointed to on the projection behind him. She had seen it before, lived in its dirt, studied its valleys, memorized its winds. He was lecturing on a battlefield she had once walked. And every word he spoke was leading these young cadets toward a grave mistake. Her hand tightened on the broom handle until her knuckles paled. She wanted to shake her head, to whisper, to do anything but remain silent. Yet silence had been her shield for more than 2 decades. Speaking would mean everything unraveling. The cadets didn't notice her. They rarely did. To them, she was background noise, someone who emptied trash cans, mopped floors, and blended into the academy's heartbeat. They were too young, too hungry, too focused on the brass at the front of the room to see the ghost walking among them. Remembered being them once, eager, sharp-eyed, wearing her uniform with a kind of fierce pride that burned like fire in the chest. She remembered nights hunched over maps, drills that stretched her to exhaustion, and the thrill of belonging to something greater than herself. But that was another life. The colonel moved markers across the board, explaining how a direct assault through the main valley, supported by flanking diversion, would guarantee success. The cadets scribbled notes. Some nodded eagerly, as though the wisdom of war was being etched into their minds. Felt heat rise behind her sternum. That valley was a kill zone. She had seen what lay there, not hypothetically, not in the sterile light of a classroom, in blood and fire and the sickening silence that followed when the dust settled over bodies. She pressed the broom bristles harder into the polished floor, scrubbing a spot that was already spotless. Her heart drummed against her ribs. Her breathing felt loud. "Don't stay quiet, you promised yourself." But the colonel went on, painting disaster with his markers as though it were strategy. He spoke of sniper teams neutralizing observation posts. He placed them in all the wrong ridges, textbook placements that reality would have punished. He spoke of timing, of coordination, of doctrine, of everything neat and tidy. Reality was never tidy. A cadet raised her hand. "Sir, what if the enemy had observers hidden on the surrounding? Wouldn't the direct approach expose us to ambush?" Froze, her eyes snapping toward the voice. A young woman, sharp, brave enough to ask the question that burned in its own chest. For a second, lips parted as if she could breathe through her. The colonel smiled. "Excellent point, cadet. That's why doctrine calls for reconnaissance to identify and neutralize those posts. Standard procedure. Standard, predictable, deadly." Shut her eyes. She could almost see it again, night falling over jagged ridges, the faint glint of enemy scopes where doctrine would never look, the snap decision that had meant life or death for people who trusted her. She tasted the copper of memory. She pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth, steadying herself. 8 years she had kept her silence. 8 years of pushing a cart through these halls, sweeping around boots that marched past without seeing her. 8 years of burying the part of her that once stood where the colonel stood now. But as he dragged another marker into the wrong position, something inside her broke. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture. She set the broom aside against the wall, straightened. For the first time in years, she did not hunch or shrink. Her steps sounded different, heavier, more deliberate as she began walking down the aisle toward the stage. One cadet noticed, then another. 600 pairs of eyes turned, confusion spreading like a ripple across the sea of uniforms. The janitor was walking to the front. The colonel faltered mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," he called into the microphone, irritation creeping into his tone. "This is a closed lecture. Please return to your duties." Didn't answer. She mounted the first step of the stage. Her breath came slow, steady. Her gaze locked not on him, but on the tactical board, on the markers arranged into a death sentence disguised as doctrine. The colonel stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area." For a moment, the weight of her choice pressed down on her shoulders. 23 years of secrets. A life rebuilt on anonymity. The promise she had made to herself never to let the past bleed into the present. All of it teetered on the edge of collapse. And yet, she met his eyes. Her voice was calm, even, but it carried an authority no mop bucket could disguise. "Your approach is wrong." The auditorium went silent. Reached past the colonel, her fingers steady as she moved one of the blue markers to a place near the edge of the map. A location that looked like nothing, a stretch of terrain doctrine dismissed as impassable. Gasps flickered through the cadet ranks. The colonel stiffened. Continued. Her voice, unused for command in nearly 2 decades, fell back into its old cadence, each word crisp, precise. "The enemy's primary observation post isn't here," she shifted a red marker, "but here. Concealed. Multiple escape routes. You'll never find them with standard reconnaissance." The colonel tried to interject. "I don't know who you think you." She cut him off, not with volume, with certainty. "The main defensive line isn't where you placed it. It's south. 2 kilometers. Right where your direct approach would funnel every soldier into a kill zone. Your plan would have slaughtered them." Every cadet leaned forward. The air was electric. The colonel opened his mouth, but the words failed him. Placed another marker. "The only viable approach is through this pass. At night, during the new moon, when the wind masks sound, it looks like suicide. That's why it worked." Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had lived it, not studied it. The markers fell into place like puzzle pieces finally snapping together. The board no longer looked academic. It looked alive, real. And in that moment, 600 cadets realized the janitor was not who they thought she was. The colonel's voice, thin now, broke the silence. "That's impossible." Step back, the last marker in place, the truth of her past standing bare before them. Her chest rose and fell once. "No," she said softly, "it was Operation Glass Storm." Who was she really? The question hung in the still air of the auditorium, heavier than any order, louder than any shout. 600 cadets stared, their pens frozen mid-note. The tactical board, once a classroom exercise, had become something else entirely. A battlefield reborn in miniature, markers arranged with chilling precision. And the janitor had put them there. Colonel Harrison's face drained of color. His hand hovered over his belt radio, fingers twitching toward protocol, toward control. But he didn't call it in. Not yet. He was staring at the board, then at her, then back again, like a man caught between disbelief and dawning fear. "Operation, what did you call it?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying nerves beneath his rigid frame. His eyes did not flinch. "Glass Storm." Murmurs rippled through the cadets. The name meant nothing to them. It wasn't in their textbooks. It wasn't in their lectures. It wasn't supposed to exist. Harrison barked, desperate to reassert order. That's classified fantasy, a ghost story. No such operation was ever authorized. His lips curved, but not into a smile. It was something sadder, sharper. That's what the record says. That's what it must say. But the record is a graveyard for truths that don't fit doctrine. Her words landed like stones in water. Ripples spread across the faces of the young officers in training, each cadet processing the impossible in their own way: disbelief, awe, skepticism, hunger. The cadet who had dared to question the colonel before whispered under her breath, "She knows." Heard it, her chest tightened. For 8 years she had trained herself not to hear whispers. Now they cut sharper than any blade. Colonel Harrison straightened, pulling himself taller, voice iron again. "Enough! Whoever you are, you've disrupted a lecture and trespassed onto this stage. I suggest you step down before I—" "Before you what?" interrupted quietly, not defiant, simply inevitable. "Erase me again, call me dead, pretend I never stood here." The colonel faltered, his eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" She reached into the breast pocket of her janitor's uniform. The cadets leaned forward as though the smallest movement might detonate the silence. From her pocket she pulled a coin. Black, heavy. The auditorium gasped collectively. It wasn't like the commemorative coins cadets sometimes saw, shiny with unit logos and mottos. This one was matte, etched with markings that caught the light only when tilted just so. Symbols so fine they seemed burned into the metal by secrets themselves. Colonel Harrison's jaw slackened. "Where did you get that?" His hand held it steady, palm open, her voice even. "I earned it. One of 12. The others belonged to ghosts who survived a mission that never happened." The colonel's breath caught, recognition flickering behind his eyes. He had heard rumors of such things as coins without insignia, made from materials never acknowledged in supply chains. But rumors were one thing. Seeing one was another. The cadets sat in stunned silence, their textbooks suddenly feeling irrelevant, their doctrine like children's games in the face of something older, heavier. "Impossible," Harrison muttered. "Major died in 2002, training accident, documented, confirmed." Felt the words cut deep, though she had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times. "Major did die," she said, voice carrying through the hall like a confession. "She died the day glass storm ended. What you see now," she gestured at her uniform, "the mop bucket resting abandoned near the stage, is what remained after I buried her." Gasps, a low murmur swelled, cadets whispering, she's." His hand shot up again, trembling slightly, but her eyes blazed with something fierce. "Ma'am, are you saying you're that major, the one," she hesitated, because there was no official history to cite, "the one they said never existed?" His throat tightened. She saw in the fire she once had before shadows and silence became her refuge. "Yes," she said simply, "and no, I was her. I am what she left behind." Colonel Harrison's composure cracked. His training screamed at him to shut this down, to call security, to regain control. But his instincts, his human instincts, couldn't look away from the board, from the plan laid out with such brutal clarity. "You expect me to believe you walked away from the grave?" he demanded. "No," replied. "I expect you to believe your own eyes. Look at the board, look at the placements. Ask yourself who could have drawn them, who would know." The colonel glanced back at the markers. Each one carried weight, purpose, logic that exceeded doctrine. His face hardened. "If, and I mean if, what you say is true," he said slowly, "you've just violated classifications higher than anything these cadets will ever touch. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done?" Inhaled deeply, her chest rising, her voice softer now. "Do you understand the magnitude of what you've been teaching? You're showing them plans that would get soldiers killed. 600 futures sat here today absorbing your mistakes. Could you live with that?" Her words hit him where rank couldn't shield him. His eyes flickered, the weight of command colliding with the weight of truth. turned, her gaze sweeping across the cadets. Young faces, bright, eager, some pale with confusion, some lit with awe, some searching for cracks in her story. "You deserve better than theory," she told them. "Better than mistakes repeated because they look neat on paper. The battlefield doesn't forgive neat." Her voice trembled just slightly at the edges, not from fear but from memory. She felt again the cold mountain wind, the silence after explosions, the faces of men and women who had followed her plan and lived barely, and those who hadn't. She clenched her fists at her sides. Glass storm happened. It succeeded because we abandoned everything you've been taught about conventional tactics. It succeeded because we dared to do what seemed impossible. The cadets held their breath, whispered almost reverently, "Teach us." Froze. She had spent years burying that part of herself, refusing to resurrect it. But the hunger in their faces, the desperate need for something real, something true, stirred something she thought had died with her commission. Her heart pounded. She looked back at Harrison. His jaw tightened, his hand twitching again toward his radio. "Colonel," she said, her voice low but steady, "you can have me escorted out. Report me. Erase this moment as if it never happened. Or you can admit what you saw and let them learn what truth looks like." The colonel's nostrils flared. His world, his structure, his command, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. He was a man who had built his career on doctrine, and now doctrine itself had been challenged by the woman he had dismissed as a cleaner. The silence was unbearable. Then from the third row's voice cut through. "Sir, if she's lying, why does it feel more real than everything else we've been taught?" The colonel spun toward her, ready to chastise her, but her words hit him harder than's had. The cadets were choosing what to believe. Stood on that stage, feeling the weight of two lives collide, the one she had buried, and the one she had lived in shadows. For the first time in 23 years, she felt both burning inside her. She whispered, almost to herself, "Truth doesn't care about clearance." And with that, the room's silence deepened. A silence not of disbelief, but of waiting. Waiting for the colonel's choice. Waiting for the past to decide whether it would stay buried or rise. What happens when silence breaks and refuses to be buried again? 600 cadets leaned forward in their seats, the air thick with something no textbook could ever provide. The tactical board glowed with rearranged markers, each one a quiet accusation against doctrine. The colonel stood stiff, pale, his authority suspended in the balance. And Janitor, ghost, soldier, felt the weight of 2 decades pressing against her ribs. She hadn't meant to speak, not today, not ever, but the truth had its own gravity. Once released, it pulled everything into its orbit. She could see it in the cadets' faces, especially her eyes wide, her pen forgotten, her breath caught between disbelief and reverence. They weren't looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at a relic, a survivor of a story that wasn't supposed to exist. Swallowed hard, her mouth was dry. The words she'd buried for 23 years scraped against her throat as they rose. "You want to know who I was," she said, her voice low but carrying, "before I pushed a broom?" No one moved. "I was Major, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. I planned operations no one will ever read about. Operations that weren't supposed to be possible. Operations that were supposed to leave no trace, and they didn't. At least, not on paper." She let the words hang, her gaze sweeping across the sea of uniforms. Their posture had shifted, no longer cadets at a lecture, but an audience pulled into something heavier, something forbidden. The colonel finally found his voice, though it trembled. "This is absurd. Major died, confirmed." Looked at him, her expression unreadable. "She did. The woman I was ended on a mountainside 23 years ago. What survived was a shadow. I traded the uniform for silence because that was the cost of success. You call it absurd. I call it survival." The cadets stirred. Some exchanged glances, whispers fluttering like restless wings, pressed on before doubt could settle. You study doctrine, you memorize history, but you don't see the shadows, the operations that never make it into the books, because admitting they happened would undo the very foundation of what you're taught to believe. She felt her chest tighten, the memory creeping back, raw and uninvited. Long nights hunched over satellite images, patterns no one else noticed, anomalies dismissed as noise. She had seen them, stitched them together, found threads where others saw blank space. "That's why I was there," she said, softer now. "I saw patterns, I saw what others missed. They called it instinct, but it was obsession. It kept people alive and it broke me." His hand rose, trembling but determined, nodded to her. "Ma'am, if you were who you say, why hide? Why disappear?" Inhaled, she had expected the question, dreaded it. Because when you live in shadows long enough, the light burns, and because some missions succeed only if the people who carried them vanish. I was told to disappear, and I obeyed, until today. The colonel shook his head, though his hand still fidgeted. "Even if I entertained this fantasy, why now? Why here?" Turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Because you were teaching them death, because your markers would send them straight into a slaughter, and I couldn't watch another generation inherit the same mistakes." A silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then stepped closer to the board, her hand hovering over the markers. "Glass Storm. That was the name we gave it. An operation buried so deep in classification that even whispers about it were forbidden. Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, it changed everything." Her voice took on a rhythm, not quite storytelling, not quite briefing, something in between. "It began with intelligence, a facility that didn't exist, producing materials that couldn't be made. Every satellite failed, every asset compromised, every door locked. On paper it was impregnable, which meant on paper it was untouchable, but wars aren't won on paper." She paused, feeling her heartbeat climb. The auditorium was so still she could hear the hum of the lights. "So we built a plan that broke every rule, 6 months of preparation, identities created out of nothing, cover stories layered like armor, and a team who lived lives that weren't theirs until they became them. We didn't fight our enemy's strength, we made their strength blind." Her eyes clouded for a moment. She could still see their faces. The team, the ones who became ghosts long before the mission ended. She closed her hand, forcing herself back to the present. "That's why your lecture cut so deep, Colonel. You stood here teaching doctrine. Doctrine would have buried us all. Doctrine nearly did. And if I hadn't—" Her voice caught. She forced the words out. "If I hadn't broken every principle we'd ever been taught, none of us would walked away." The cadets were leaning forward now, every word sinking in. Some looked pale, unsettled. Others glowed with awe, as though watching history peel itself open. The colonel's voice was softer now, though it carried steel beneath. "You're asking us to believe you rewrote doctrine itself, that you succeeded where the entire system said you couldn't. That's not just extraordinary, it's dangerous." Turned to him, her face tired but unflinching. "Dangerous? Yes, but necessary. Sometimes the only way to succeed is to attempt what looks like suicide. That's the truth they deserve to know." His voice rose again, almost pleading. "Ma'am, teach us, please." Felt her throat tighten. They didn't understand what they were asking. They couldn't. Her hands trembled slightly. "What I can teach you isn't a plan or a manual. It's a way of seeing, of asking the question no one else dares to ask. What if everything we assume is wrong?" The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting we abandon discipline, abandon structure. Without it, there's chaos." Shook her head. "I'm suggesting you understand when structure becomes the trap, when order leads to death, when the only survival is in the cracks, the shadows, the impossible roots." The room felt heavier. The cadets caught between two worlds, the comfort of doctrine and the raw electricity of forbidden truth. Looked out over them, her chest aching with memory. "You study the clean lines, I live the chaos, and chaos is what keeps you alive." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the colonel whispered almost to himself, "If you're right, then everything we teach here, everything, is built on lies." Met his eyes, not lies, just half-truths, and half-truths kill. The silence that followed was thicker than before. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was fear, the fear of realizing the ground beneath your feet may not be solid at all. How do you tell 600 cadets that everything they thought they knew about war was wrong? Stood in the glow of the tactical board, her fingers brushing the markers she'd placed like ghosts of a past that never officially existed. The colonel's face was stiff, but his eyes betrayed the conflict raging inside him. The cadets sat frozen, pens forgotten, hungry and terrified in equal measure. And knew the moment had come. The silence begged for it. The truth, or at least the sliver of it she was willing to share. "Let me tell you," she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges, "what really happened." The room leaned toward her. It was early 2001 began. Intelligence picked up fragments of something unusual. Not chatter, not movement, something stranger, gaps. A place where data should exist but didn't. A black hole in the grid. A facility that officially wasn't there. Every satellite sweep showed nothing but noise. Every informant who got too close vanished. Every technical attempt to peek inside was blinded. On paper, the place was impregnable. Her hand hovered over the map projection, her eyes glazing slightly as memory bled into the present. Conventional doctrine said forget it. You don't breach what you can't see. But leadership wanted answers. So they came to us, the people who planned the operations that couldn't exist. And they asked the question that changes everything. What if impossible isn't impossible? The cadets whispered, shifting in their seats. Some looked exhilarated, others unsettled. Sat on the edge of her chair, her eyes locked on as though she might catch every unspoken syllable. "We didn't build a plan the way you're taught," continued. "We didn't start with objectives and work backward. We started with the lie, with the story the enemy already believed. Their greatest strength was paranoia, the conviction that their security was unbreakable. So we fed that paranoia until it blinded them." She stepped away from the board, her voice steadier now, falling into the rhythm of memory. "For 18 months we built a company, a real one. Paperwork, tax records, contracts, trucks, uniforms, everything. A telecommunications provider, harmless, forgettable, invisible. We signed legitimate contracts to maintain the facility's systems. Every wire, every cable, every circuit. We became part of their world until they stopped seeing us at all." Gasps flickered across the cadets. One muttered, "You lived inside it." Nodded. 3 months before the operation, we moved in as maintenance crews. Not infiltrating, just working. Sweeping halls, checking routers, replacing equipment, eating in their cafeterias. Playing cards with their security staff, smiling, nodding, pretending, until the pretending stopped being pretend. Her voice faltered. A shadow crossed her face. "Do you know what it means," she asked, her tone heavier now, "to live a lie so deep that even you forget where the mask ends? Some of my people couldn't tell anymore. They became their covers. Laughed at jokes in languages they didn't speak 6 months before. Built friendships with men they would later betray. They had to, or we'd all be dead." The cadets shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't doctrine. This wasn't neat. It was human and messy, and it cut deeper than strategy. The colonel's voice broke through, strained. "You're describing treason, deception at a level it's unsustainable." His eyes flashed. Unsustainable, yes. That's why it had to end in 6 hours. But treason, she stepped closer to him, her voice sharp. Treason would have been doing nothing. Treason would have been letting that facility finish what it was building. Her words cracked through the auditorium. For a long moment, no one moved. Then exhaled, forcing herself back into the flow of memory. "The night it began was ordinary. That was the point. We clocked in like always, logged maintenance schedules, ate a meal we'd eaten 100 times before, and when the moment came, we moved. Not with weapons, with silence, with precision. with every detail we had spent 2 years weaving into the fabric of their reality. Her hands moved unconsciously, sketching the shape of it in the air. One team rerouted communications. Another seeded failures into their power grid. My team, we slipped into the heart of the facility disguised as the very people who were supposed to protect it. Her eyes clouded again, the images flashing behind them. She could still smell the dust, the hum of the servers, the weight of eyes that never suspected. And in that moment, every assumption collapsed. They thought their walls were impenetrable. They thought their systems were flawless. They thought their paranoia made them safe. But paranoia doesn't protect you from the enemy you don't believe exists. Leaned forward, her voice trembling but eager. What happened next? His chest rose and fell, her throat tight. The hardest part was still buried, the part that cost the most. She looked out at the 600 faces, at the hunger in their eyes, the fear on their lips. She wanted to tell them everything, to pour it all out, but she knew the danger of too much truth. What happened next, she said softly, was that 6 months of lies turned into 6 hours of silence. And in those hours, we did what doctrine said couldn't be done. Her eyes flicked to the colonel. But the cost wasn't measured in bodies or bullets. It was measured in pieces of ourselves we'll never get back. The colonel stared at her, his face pale, his hands tight at his sides. You expect us to believe this ghost story, that you lived inside an enemy's fortress for months without detection. His voice dropped, low and unwavering. I don't care if you believe it. I care that they, she gestured to the cadets, understand that sometimes the only way to win is to become invisible, to disappear so completely that even you forget you're there, until the moment you strike. The cadets were silent, their notebooks abandoned, their eyes wide. Some seemed enthralled, others unsettled, as though the ground beneath their training had just cracked open. His hand brushed the black challenge coin in her pocket. She could feel its weight, the reminder of the ghosts who had walked beside her. She exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. That's how Glass Storm began, with a lie so perfect it became the truth. She turned back to the board, her hand hovering over the markers. And when the night finally came, when the masks finally slipped, her voice trailed off. The silence grew unbearable. The cadets leaned forward, whispered urgent, and then closed her eyes. The images of that night flooded back, sharper than any blade. She opened them again, steady but heavy. Then, she said, the storm broke. What does it feel like when a lie finally becomes a weapon? His eyes flickered as though she were looking not at the cadets, not at the colonel, but at something far away. The board behind her blurred into shadow. The room seemed to fade. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory so sharp it pulled everyone into it. It began with silence, she said. The cadets leaned forward, as though the hush itself were part of the story. 0200 hours, lights out across the valley. Our crews signed into the maintenance logs like we had done 100 times before. No alarms, no suspicion. We moved with the rhythm of habit because that's what cover is, not disguise. Habit, routine. The enemy trusted us because they stopped seeing us. Her hands mimed motions, tapping a keypad, swiping a card. The cadets could almost see it. Hallways lined with steel, fluorescent lights buzzing, guards nodding as the maintenance team passed. We split into threes, no radios, no chatter. Every step timed to the minute, every action rehearsed until instinct replaced thought. One team went to the communications wing. They rerouted signals, disguised failures as routine glitches. Another seeded the power grid with faults so small they looked like accidents. My team went to the core. Her voice faltered for half a beat, then hardened. The core was where the materials were stored, sensitive, volatile, guarded more by fear than by men. That was the beating heart. That was the objective. His breath caught. A dozen cadets clutched their pens but didn't write, as though afraid the sound of ink would break the spell. His eyes glazed again. We wore their uniforms, walked their halls, past their checkpoints. The guards nodded, bored. Some even joked with us. They had no idea that the people they shared cigarettes with in the courtyard were about to unravel their fortress from the inside. She paused. Do you know what betrayal feels like when it's necessary? It burns. You make eye contact with a man you've eaten meals with and you tell yourself, tonight you end everything he believes is safe. And you do it with a smile. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of sacrifice they had imagined when they'd put on their uniforms. The first fault triggered at 0230 said, a transformer failure routine, nothing unusual, lights flickered, power cycled. Guards grumbled, maintenance crews were dispatched, us, exactly as planned. Her hands moved unconsciously, sketching the memory. We walked straight into restricted zones, holding clipboards, carrying tools, and the enemy opened the doors for us. She let that hang for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on every cadet. By 0300, communications were rerouted. Their security network was blind in 3 sectors and thought it was just a software patch. At 0310, my team reached the vault, a room colder than ice, humming with generators, every crate inside marked with numbers that didn't officially exist. Her throat tightened. The memory was too sharp, too heavy. That was when it hit me, the scale, the stakes. We weren't just disabling a building. We were erasing something the world wasn't ready to face, and if we failed, no one would ever know why. The colonel shifted in his seat, his face pale, his eyes locked on her like a man watching his own world crack. Steadied her voice. We didn't destroy it. Destruction leaves fingerprints. Instead, we seeded it. Contaminants so subtle they looked like flaws in supply. Materials degraded invisibly, their processes failing days or weeks later until production collapsed without cause. By the time they realized, the world had already moved on, and no one traced it to us. His whisper broke the silence. That's brilliant. His eyes flicked to her, sharp. Brilliant doesn't comfort the people who lost themselves making it possible. The room stilled. One of my team, he laughed as he worked, said it was too easy, but I could see his hands shake when he touched those crates. He had been living as a technician so long, he wasn't sure which life was real anymore. That's the cost you don't see in manuals, the fractures in identity, the ghosts that grow inside you. Her hands clenched unconsciously. At 0340, everything shifted. A guard stepped into the vault unexpectedly. Routine patrol. He saw us where we shouldn't have been. For a heartbeat, the world froze. His eyes narrowed. Mine didn't. The cadets leaned in, breathless. I smiled, held up a clipboard, muttered about faulty wiring, and he bought it. He let us finish, walked away. And I realized in that moment how fragile the line was between success and death. One heartbeat, one glance, that's all it takes. Her voice cracked softly. When we exfiltrated, we didn't run. We clocked out, logged our hours, handed in equipment, walked out the front gate under floodlights, nodding goodnight to men who would never know what had just been stolen from them. The cadets exhaled, as though they had been holding their breath the entire time. Stepped back from the board, her shoulders sagging under invisible weight. By dawn, the facility was crippled, though no one knew it yet. 6 months of their production turned to dust. 6 hours of silence accomplished what no amount of firepower could have, and none of it would ever be written down. His hand rose slowly, her voice trembling. Ma'am, what did it cost you? His eyes darkened. She looked down at her hands, hands that had once sketched impossible plans on endless maps. Pieces of ourselves, she whispered. Some never came back, some didn't want to. We became lies so complete we forgot who we were. And when it was over, there was no parade, no medal, no recognition, just silence, and the order to disappear. Her gaze swept across the 600 cadets, their faces pale with the enormity of it. That's the truth of Glass Storm. Victory without glory, success without, and wounds that never heal. The colonel swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. And you expect us to accept this as truth, without evidence, without proof. Reached into her pocket, the black coin glinted in her palm. I don't expect you to accept anything, she said. But ask yourself why doctrine could never explain what I just told you. Ask yourself why the official story says I died in 2002. Ask yourself why 600 of you just felt more truth in my words than in every lecture you've heard in this room. The silence was suffocating. Then's eyes lifted, her voice softer, almost breaking. We succeeded that night, but success didn't feel like triumph. It felt like loss, and the storm we unleashed, it never really ended, not for me. The cadets sat stunned, caught between awe and dread. The colonel's knuckles whitened against the arm of his chair. His voice dropped to a whisper, because sometimes survival doesn't mean you live, it just means you keep walking. How do you follow silence that feels heavier than war? The auditorium had stopped breathing. 600 cadets sat frozen, their notebooks open but useless, their pens resting like abandoned rifles. Words still hung in the air, echoes of 6 hours that had rewritten what they thought they knew about conflict. Colonel Harrison's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on her with the cold calculation of a man torn between disbelief and something darker, recognition. His hand trembled in midair, not because she wanted to ask another question, but because she needed to anchor herself in the storm of what she'd just heard. Stood still, her chest rising and falling, the black coin heavy in her palm. For a moment she almost slipped it back into her pocket, back into hiding. But the eyes staring at her, 600 pairs, wide and hungry, pulled the truth out of her again. You want to know what I learned, she said, her voice low but steady. Not tactics, not blueprints, lessons. The kind they don't put in doctrine because they don't fit neat diagrams. The cadets leaned in, as though they were hearing a forbidden prayer. The first lesson began, is that most failures happen because we try to solve the wrong problem. We accept the objective as written, the assumptions as given. We aim at the obvious target and walk straight into the ambush. But sometimes, the real problem is hidden. You have to ask, what if the question itself is wrong? She looked at, in Glass Storm, the question was, how do we destroy the facility? The question was, how do we make it useless without anyone knowing we touched it? Change the question, and the solution appears. A murmur rippled through the cadets. Heads nodded slowly. Others scribbled the thought in frantic handwriting, desperate not to lose it. The second lesson, said, her voice tightening, is that your enemy's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness. That fortress was impenetrable because they believed it was impenetrable. Their confidence made them blind. We didn't break their walls, we let their walls trap them. She let her gaze sweep the rows. Doctrine won't teach you that. Doctrine will teach you to meet strength with strength, but strength blinds, always look where they don't. Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressed thin. Could see the war in his eyes, the urge to shut her down, and the reluctant acknowledgement that every word carried weight. The third lesson, she continued, is that the most effective operations don't look like operations at all. If your enemy can identify what happened, even after you succeed, you've already failed. The best victories look like accidents, failures, natural events, nothing anyone can trace. Her voice lowered. That's why you don't know about Glass Storm, because to the enemy it never happened. They shut down their facility blaming suppliers, engineers, bad luck. They never saw us. That's why we won. The cadets sat stunned. Some whispered. Others stared straight ahead as if afraid to move. His tone softened. And the fourth lesson, she paused, the weight of it pressing into her bones. The fourth lesson is the cost. You don't measure it in bodies. You measure it in identity, in silence, in lives erased. Glass Storm didn't kill me on the battlefield. It killed who I was. That's a casualty you'll never see in reports, but it's real and permanent. Her words dropped like stones into the silence. His eyes glistened. She swallowed hard before asking, would you do it again? Exhaled slowly. That's the question that keeps me awake, because yes, I would, even knowing the cost, and that's why it hurts. The cadets shifted, the truth of sacrifice settling over them like a shroud. Colonel Harrison finally spoke, his voice rough. What you're describing undermines everything we build here. Discipline, order, trust in doctrine. If I let you keep speaking, I risk undoing the very foundation of this academy. Met his gaze. Or you risk saving lives that doctrine would waste. The choice isn't whether to undo the foundation. The choice is whether to let it grow. The colonel's jaw clenched. His hand twitched near his radio again, then stopped. His silence was louder than his words. Turned back to the cadets, her voice softer now, reflective. You will all wear rank, you will all command, and one day you will face a problem that doctrine can't solve. You'll have incomplete intelligence, impossible orders, lives depending on you. And you'll feel the temptation to follow the book because it's safe, because it's what you were taught. That's the moment you'll remember today. The moment you'll ask yourself, is the obvious plan the real plan? Her throat tightened. That's when you'll decide whether to be leaders or just operators of doctrine. The cadets sat in silence. Some leaned forward with reverence. Others looked pale as though the ground beneath them had shifted, but all of them listened. His hands gripped the edge of the table before her. You think strength comes from certainty. It doesn't. It comes from knowing when to abandon certainty, from having the courage to attempt what everyone else calls impossible. That's not heroism, that's survival. The colonel's voice was low now, almost a whisper. If what you say is true, then every cadet in this room just saw more than they were ever supposed to. You've compromised security on a level, he trailed off, unable to finish. Looked at him, her expression tired but resolute. No, I haven't told them methods. I haven't given them tools the enemy could use. I've given them something else. Permission. Permission to think differently. Permission to question. Permission to survive. His voice cut through, firm now. Sir, she's right. Doctrine teaches us how to fight battles that already happened. What she's teaching us, it might save us in the ones still to come. The colonel turned toward her sharply, but the words caught in his throat. Because she wasn't alone. Dozens of cadets nodded, their faces set with new conviction. His eyes swept over them one last time. She felt the ache in her chest, guilt, hope, sorrow, all tangled together. She whispered almost to herself, "This is why I came back into the light, not for glory, not for recognition, for them, for the ones who will inherit the silence I carried." The colonel stood slowly, his expression unreadable. The radio was still clipped to his belt, but his hand didn't move toward it. Instead, he looked out at the cadets, then back at her. And in that silence knew, his choice wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about truth. What happens when survival feels like death? His voice had softened, her eyes drifting past the cadets, past the colonel, past the board. She wasn't in the auditorium anymore. She was back there, 23 years ago, in the silence after the storm. We walked out of the facility under floodlights, she began, her tone distant, measured. Nodded goodnight to guards who thought we were theirs. By dawn, we were ghosts. No alarms, no gunfire, just silence. The kind of silence that hides a wound too deep to see. The cadets leaned in again, caught in the pull of her voice. Our extraction wasn't glory. No helicopters roaring, no triumphant march, just a van, dusty, forgettable. We climbed inside without a word, without looking back. And as the gates closed behind us, I knew that was the last time any of us would exist. She paused, swallowing against the lump in her throat. At the debrief, they didn't thank us. They didn't congratulate us. They studied us. Every detail, every step, every breath of the operation, like scientists dissecting a specimen. They wanted to know what worked, what didn't, how to replicate the impossible. And then they erased it, redacted everything, sealed it so deep in classification it may as well have been burned. Her hand trembled slightly. They told us we were heroes. Then they told us we never existed. They handed us papers, new names, new lives. and they told us to disappear, to bury ourselves in places no one would look. Her gaze flicked to the cadets, their faces pale, their uniforms neat, their futures still bright. You think death is the greatest sacrifice. It is. Erasure is. To live as though you're already dead. To watch the world move on, knowing you left pieces of yourself in shadows no one will ever honor. The colonel's throat tightened. He'd heard whispers of such things, rumors of units that dissolved into silence after missions that never officially happened. But hearing it now, raw and human, unsettled him more than any story he'd ever read. One by one my people vanished, continued. Disappeared into a cover job so deep I don't know if he ever crawled out. Changed her face, her accent, her life. I never heard from her again. Some didn't make it. Suicide, accidents, shadows that grew too heavy. They became ghosts not just in files but in truth. She looked down at her hands, her voice breaking. And me? They killed me with a pen. Major declared dead in a training accident 2002. A line in a file. A folded flag delivered to no one. My parents, my sister, they never even got the call. They thought I vanished. And in a way, I did. The cadets shifted, some covering their mouths, others staring wide-eyed. Exhaled slowly. After that, I lived like a shadow. Odd jobs, moving town to town, no attachments, no recognition. Every day a reminder that my real name was a liability, that to speak it aloud was to endanger the mission we had already buried. For years I convinced myself it was enough, that survival was victory. But survival isn't the same as living. His eyes shimmered with tears. She whispered, "Why a janitor?" Let out a fragile breath. Because cleaning floors doesn't demand lies, because it's honest work, invisible work. No one questions the janitor. No one asks about her past. I thought if I stripped myself down to something simple, maybe I could finally be free. Her eyes lifted, sharp and tired. But you never escape the silence. You carry it, every bucket, every mop stroke, every night. And then one day you walk into an auditorium and you see 600 young faces being fed doctrine that would killed you and everyone you loved. And you realize maybe silence isn't dignity. Maybe silence is just cowardice. The words cut deeper than any tactical lesson. The colonel's lips parted, but he said nothing. The cadets sat rigid, torn between awe and grief. His voice dropped lower, almost trembling. You want to know the truth? I didn't come here to correct a lecture. I came here to see if I still existed, to see if there was anything left of the woman they buried in 2002. And standing here, I don't know if that was a mistake. She turned away from the board, her shoulders sagging under invisible weight. The cadets saw not a strategist, not a ghost, but a human being fractured by sacrifice. The silence grew unbearable. Then stood, she didn't wait for permission. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Ma'am, you exist, right here, right now, and we see you." The words broke something in his chest. Her eyes glistened. She hadn't cried in years. She wasn't sure she remembered how. But in that moment, with 600 cadets staring at her not as a ghost, not as a janitor, but as a soldier, she felt alive. The colonel's voice came at last, low and rough. "And what happens now?" Looked at him. For once she didn't have a plan. "What do you do when the truth stands before you, and every rule says to silence it?" The auditorium felt frozen. The tactical board glowed faintly behind, its markers still arranged in a pattern that had exposed more than a lecture ever could. The cadets sat in their rows, breaths shallow, eyes locked on the woman who had just unraveled the line between ghost story and reality. And Colonel Harrison stood torn. His hand hovered near the radio clipped to his belt, protocol whispering in his ear, "Report her. Detain her. Erase this moment before it spreads." But another voice, older, deeper, told him what the cadet's eyes already knew. This wasn't madness. It was truth. And truth, once spoken, refuses to be buried again. Met his gaze. Her eyes were tired but steady. "You want to know what happens now," she said quietly. "That's the question, isn't it? Do you call security? Do you drag me out of here and scrub this moment clean, or do you let it stand?" Her words lingered like smoke. Rose again, her hands trembling but her chin firm. "Sir, we can't hear this. We can't see it. If you silence her, you silence all of us." Dozens of cadets shifted, nodding subtly. Not rebellion, not mutiny. Something quieter, stronger recognition. The colonel's jaw tightened. He scanned the rows, their young faces reflecting conviction that reminded him of his own cadet days, long buried under layers of doctrine and order. For the first time in years, he saw not students but soldiers. Broke the silence. "I'm not here to overthrow your order, Colonel. I'm here because order without truth is fragile, and fragile cracks when lives depend on it." She stepped forward, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "I carried silence for 2 decades. I told myself it was duty. That disappearing was part of the mission. But tonight I realized silence isn't always loyalty. Sometimes it's surrender, and I won't surrender anymore." The cadets held their breath. The colonel's hand slipped from his radio. He exhaled slowly, his face pale but resolute. "You realize what you've done here can't be contained," he said. Nodded. "Good." A ripple of shock moved through the cadets. The colonel stared at her, his eyes unreadable. "Then say it. Finish it. If you want this moment to mean something, leave them with more than stories." His throat tightened. She hadn't expected permission, not from him. She turned toward the cadets, her voice steady but carrying a weight that cracked at the edges. "You came here to learn how to fight wars, but wars aren't won by clean diagrams and doctrine. Wars are survived by those who dare to think when everything around them says not to. Remember this, strength isn't certainty. It's doubt carried forward anyway. It's fear held steady long enough to become courage." She scanned the room, her voice softening. "You will all carry rank. You will give orders that decide who lives and who doesn't. And when you do, ask yourself, are you repeating what you were told, or are you seeing what no one else sees? One path leads to medals. The other leads to survival. They're not always the same." His eyes glistened. Others nodded, their faces set with new gravity. His voice broke slightly. "Don't chase glory, don't chase recognition. Those things vanish. What lasts is dignity, and dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't need parades. Sometimes dignity just acts, quietly, completely, even if no one ever knows." Her last words fell like a stone into the still water of the room. Silence followed, a silence not of disbelief but of reverence. Colonel Harrison finally straightened, his voice heavy but calm. "Class dismissed." The cadets didn't move, not at first. Then slowly they rose, not with the clatter of chairs or chatter, but with a quiet solemnity. One by one they looked at as they passed, not saluting, not speaking, just acknowledging. As if to say, "We heard you, we carry it now." Lingered the longest, her eyes locked once. No words, just a nod, then she was gone. The auditorium emptied, leaving only the colonel, and the tension between them was thick but different now. "You know I should report you," he said at last. His lips curved faintly, not a smile but a tired truth. "You know you won't." The colonel's eyes hardened, then softened. He shook his head slowly. "What are you going to do now?" Looked at the empty seats, the echoes of 600 cadets who had listened to the ghost of a mission that never happened. "Keep mopping floors," she said softly, "because sometimes the smallest life is the only way to carry the biggest truths." She picked up her bucket. The black coin remained in her pocket, heavy but no longer suffocating. As she walked off the stage, the colonel's voice followed her. "Major." She stopped, turned slightly. His expression was unreadable. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded and without another word pushed her mop bucket into the hall. The silence that followed was not erasure, not this time. It was remembrance.